Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the impact of war on rates of infant mortality. How big is it, and can it be mitigated? Hello, my name is Alan Rinnick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Our television screens have been filled over the past year by images of the war in Ukraine, images of destruction, death, injury, and hardship. It seems obvious that war harms civilian populations, not least children. But research can reveal much more about the nature and scale of those harms, and perhaps also about what can be done about them. And so this week we're focusing on a new study of the impact of war upon rates of infant mortality. The study is by Rod Abuharb, Associate Professor of International Relations here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and I'm delighted to say that Rod joins me now. Rod, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And I guess the first question relates to the point that I was just beginning to hint at there. We're probably safe to assume that war damages children's health and increases rates of infant mortality. So what more did you feel we needed to know that motivated you to conduct this study?
Well, just want to thank you, Alan, for having me on the podcast. So I'm delighted to be here today. So I think it's actually, I think I would say we actually know much less than we think we do when it comes to this. So even though it should seem like kind of an obvious question that there is this systematic link between war and infant mortality rates, the research up to now actually has only focused on sort of particular conflicts or particular regions. And I think one of the things that really struck me about what was sort of missing in our understanding is that the kind of the large N systematic work on this has looked at adults and even children, but not infants. And that might sound pedantic, but it's actually quite important. So in the sort of public health research on this, it looks at children up to the age of 5, but infants who are up to the age of 1 are really entirely missed out as a separate category. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. So one is that we're thinking about really sort of the most vulnerable populations, and actually the populations who have in many ways the least voice. And so those are sort of the things that really struck me about it. And then in trying to understand the link between war and infant mortality rates, I think the other thing that was a sort of missing in our understanding of this is, do different types of wars have similar or different effects? And then how do kind of the immediate effects of war differ from the kind of the lingering effects of conflict? And again, in some ways, the previous research has been quite descriptive, but not particularly analytical. And I'm really interested in understanding kind of, so, why might these wars have different effects? And are there ways that we should be trying, if that's true, then I think that also points to, how we can think about kind of mitigating the negative effects of these conflicts, which you sort of mentioned in the intro.
So you mentioned there are two different distinctions, the distinction between different types of war and the distinction between different kinds of effects, immediate and lingering effects. Do you want just to unpack those a little bit further? What different types of war do you have in mind, first of all?
Sure. So in sort of international relations, the two big categories of conflicts that we tend to think about are, one, what I would describe as civil wars. So these are conflicts within national boundaries. And then the second is sort of interstate wars. So these are kind of wars between states. And the research tends to look at either one or the other. And of course, the thing is, if we think that both these types of conflicts have a public health impact, and in my research I'm looking at infants in particular, then actually if you only look at one type of war, then you're missing the effects of the other. So that's, I think, an important reason to have both in any of our empirical models, to understand kind of the overall impact of conflict. And then the second one is between what we talk about, kind of the immediate and then the sort of lingering effects. So the immediate effects in some ways are, if you look at the coverage of the conflict in Ukraine at the moment, you're thinking about hospitals being bombed, you're thinking about populations being bombed, about the electricity networks and the sewage networks and all these other things, that the infrastructure that keeps populations healthy, all being attacked. And these types of immediate effects are really, what happens from if you're a victim of the conflict itself, right? So you are in the wrong place at the wrong time and the bomb hits you, or you get caught in crossfire. Or, as we know, actually, in a number of wars, parties to these conflicts will target healthcare facilities, will target other types of civilian infrastructure, which they shouldn't be doing. And even in the early weeks of the war in Ukraine, children and infants were being killed as part of that. And then, sort of moving, I think, on the lingering effects aspect is this tries to get at the idea of what happens if you are in a sort of a war-torn society. So we know that the kind of the progressive consequences of these wars destroy some of these key infrastructures, destroy many of the key sort of support processes that keep populations healthy, and it makes it sort of very difficult to go to the doctors, right? So things that you and I would take for granted in peacetime, going to the GP, well, maybe not in the UK right now, but going to the GP, accessing going to hospital, getting medical care when we need it, that is very, very difficult in war zones and very, very dangerous. And so these things become much more limited for the civilian population. And then the other types of infrastructure, which is typically destroyed during conflicts, the things like water treatment works, the things like even things that you wouldn't directly link to mortality rates, like, for example, the road network, right? So if you destroy the road network, it's then very difficult to get supplies in. It's very difficult to get access to medical care, access to foodstuffs and the like. And then the lingering component to that is we know it takes a long time for societies to recover from that. So it could be that the hospital was destroyed 3 or 4 years ago, but actually it takes a long time to rebuild that. And we know from previous research that these lingering effects continue even after the conflict stops, right? Because that hospital hasn't been rebuilt, right? That bridge hasn't been rebuilt that links the key arteries across a particular country. So it's really trying to get a sense of what do these sort of longer term consequences of conflict look like on mortality rates.
Right. So we have kind of direct and indirect effects of war, and then the direct effects might drop away once a war stops, but those indirect effects can linger for a long time afterwards. And so what sorts of expectations did you bring to the analysis here? And were you expecting to find a difference, for example, between civil wars and interstate wars?
So I think, and I suppose I have kind of a background interest here in how the international system post-World War II kind of organized itself. So if you like, in the background here is the role of the Geneva Conventions. And I think we can talk about how we might sort of assess that directly later on, but in the background here is the Geneva Conventions. And then what that obliges states to do is that it really, so even wars have rules, right? And it obliges states to protect civilians from harm in these conflicts. And in particular, those conventions were written with a focus on sort of interstate wars. Now, there's an argument about the extent to which they apply in civil wars, but certainly with interstate wars, I was expecting that the effects of these wars would be smaller in comparison to civil wars, precisely because of this legal obligation that states have to protect civilians from harm. And also, we know that there's been some really interesting research on how civil wars are fought, and in particular NGOs, for example, in Syria, in Sudan, in Central African Republic, were all showing how actually the state had incentives to bomb its own healthcare infrastructure. So we saw this in Syria, where kind of opposition-held areas of the country, the hospitals there were repeatedly bombed by joint Syrian and Russian forces, air forces, and of course that's against the laws of war, right? So they shouldn't be doing this. And in that case, we would either call that a civil war or an internationalized civil war. But the argument would be that there are probably different incentives there for states. So they may actually have fewer incentives to follow these rules, given that the conflict is sort of within its own sovereign boundaries. So based on that, I was expecting these civil wars to have maybe a worsened effect in comparison to interstate wars.
Okay, interesting.
We can talk about whether or not we found that, that was sort of the basis for the idea. Yeah. And then if you want to think about is the kind of the immediate or the lingering effect worse, the literature is pretty overwhelming on this, that the lingering effects tend to be worse overall. So I was expecting that these longer term effects of these conflicts, you would see the highest kind of increase in infant mortality rates.
So we will get on to what you actually found, but before we do that, we should explore the methodology through which you're finding these things out a little bit. And I guess in essence, it's quite simple. You get the data on the incidence of war, you get data on infant mortality, you look at the relationship between the two, with some control variables in there as well. But of course, it's always more complicated than that. So I guess two questions maybe. Firstly, are there aspects of the methodology and the design of this research that you'd particularly like to highlight as being important for our listeners? Second, there was one aspect that I found particularly interesting, which was just simply around the measurement of infant mortality. And I suppose my hunch would be that in the context of war, data on infant mortality are going to become very unreliable. So, if the exercise here is about actually measuring these effects as precisely as we can, is that actually a thing that it's possible for us to do?
So that's a great question. You sound like my reviewer too. For listeners who aren't aware of the reviewer two joke, this is kind of in academic papers. We always get one horrendous reviewer who asks all the really difficult questions, and invariably it's the second reviewer on the panel. No, but seriously, these are really important questions actually, and I think the literature to now has looked at. I think I mentioned before, looked at sort of under 5 mortality rather than infant mortality, and that may seem a bit technical. Isn't it all pretty similar? And actually, one of the things that you find when you start to kind of delve into the data is that we're missing a lot of cases when it comes to under 5 mortality. So the period that I examined for the paper was 1950 to 2007. So over that period, just to give you a comparison, I had sort of 8,207 cases of infant mortality rate data available. Now, if I had been doing an under 5 study, which is what most of the research looks at, I would have only had 2,605 cases. So almost sort of 4 times, or maybe sort of 3 times the amount of data available. So I think there's the breadth of data that's available. And I think the other thing that we know is often data is missing in the countries that are in the worst circumstances, right? So either have the worst conflicts, or maybe have the worst registration systems. And those may well be the cases where you would think that the mortality rates would worsen the most in these types of conflicts. So the IMR data is much better for that purpose. We have much broader coverage. We're missing very few cases. And I think it's a sort of a better baseline to begin trying to study this stuff. Now, your question about the quality of the data during periods of conflict, I think, is a really important one. We know that the coverage is going to be more spotty. Even with the IMR data, we still have gaps in that. Now, I think there's, the international community has done a number of things to try to sort of mitigate that. So the WHO, since its inception in 1949, has placed an emphasis on sort of good quality, comparable data, including, in particular, infant mortality. The UN has a kind of a sort of a complementary system where they're also trying to generate sort of comparable IMR data over time. So I think the data quality definitely dips, and it's certainly more spotty during periods of conflict. But I think, if anything, it probably means that we underestimate the effects of these conflicts. Nevertheless, I think I have a lot more confidence in this data than if I was trying to make the case using sort of under 5 mortality data as a comparison.
Okay. And you're looking, as you said, at thousands of kind of country years, I guess, across the globe from 1950 to 2007. And you have data on levels of infant mortality. You have data on the incidence of war. We know whether that's civil war or interstate war. One thing that struck me was you don't look at the scale of conflict. I would have guessed that the scale of conflict would make a difference to infant mortality rates. Was there a reason for that?
So that's a great question. The kind of the interstate war data tends to have a threshold of 1,000 battle deaths. The civil war data you can get at lower thresholds, and in earlier versions of the work, both are in there. I think it came out for a variety of reasons, but one is to think about sort of comparability. So if I could have let's say a lower threshold for interstate wars, then I could be comparing different types of conflict, but at similar levels of hostility. And I think that sort of data limitation at the moment is one thing to think about. The 1,000 death threshold also makes it comparable to previous research on this. The most systematic previous work on this was by sort of Li and Wen, and they're interested in the impact on adult mortality. So I can sort of better compare my results to their earlier work too. Mm-hmm. So there are some sort of data constraints, and also I think making sure that I'm not comparing apples and oranges, but maybe 2 flavors of apples in the research in order to kind of understand if they have similar or different effects.
Okay, so we have a threshold of 1,000 combat deaths per year. So we're talking here about significant conflicts, but not necessarily really large-scale conflicts.
So, I mean, I think if you like, another problem with the correlates of war data, right? And to be fair, this is the best data out there, right? So this is the data that everyone uses. I think when they created the data, they weren't necessarily focusing on what the consequences of these conflicts were for civilians and other groups. They were particularly interested in trying to understand what leads to these conflicts in the first place, right? So if you like, I've sort of flipped around what is typically the dependent variable in a lot of IR research, and it becomes my independent variable, right? So the thing that I think has the effect. And then I'm looking at something which, it is of interest to some political scientists, but there's a lot more public health researchers who look at this than sort of political scientists as a whole. So in many ways, I'm trying to use data that wasn't exactly designed for this purpose, and then thinking about, right, so if this is the best data we have at the moment, then how can we sort of reasonably use it to try to understand the link between different types of wars and mortality rates?
Interesting. So we know why you wanted to do this research. We know how you did the research. The most important question is, what did you find?
So the world, in part, works the way I think it does, but not in all aspects. So we certainly find, a significant link between both types of conflicts. So when civil wars erupt to this level of severity, they have a significant impact on worsening infant mortality rates. The same is true of sort of interstate wars. If you like, kind of the point predictions around these were the sort of the opposite of what I expected. Now, I think you have to be very careful with these point predictions because, we have what we call sort of confidence intervals around them, which say, look, in reality, if you want to be sort of 95% sure, it could be a bit worse, it could be a bit better than this. And those confidence intervals overlap between the civil wars and the interstate wars. So the point prediction, civil wars flare up and you have a just over 5% increase in infant mortality rates. You get to the stage of a major interstate war, and we're looking at 10.5% increase in IMRs on average. But the predictions here overlap. So it could be that these interstate wars are in reality still worse, but we have to be somewhat cautious about that. The thing is, when you're looking at these cases, we don't have that many cases, which is why these confidence intervals are relatively wide, you might think. So that's the cautionary note with them. Having said that, it does seem to go against what I thought. And I think that's interesting, right? So I'm not going to entirely go against, discount that because it goes against what I thought. And, it may well be that we need to think more about the types of munitions that are being used, really kind of how destructive, national armies are, national air forces are, in comparison to rebel groups, right? So rebel groups typically don't have access to the kinds of weaponry that the Syrian Air Force or the Russian Air Force was using on civilians in the Syrian civil war. So that there may be something about that we're kind of underestimating at the moment.
So in some sense, interstate wars may just be bigger on average than civil wars, is kind of what you're suggesting there.
Yeah, I think so. And it could be that how we think about the threshold data of this sort of 1,000 battle deaths in many ways muddies the severity of these conflicts, right? If you have sort of fleets and fleets of bomber planes going over another country's boundaries, that is going to do a lot of damage.
Yeah. And so one of the mechanisms that you mentioned there in terms of why you were expecting interstate wars to have lower rates of increase in infant mortality was to do with the Geneva Conventions. And I think you were able to explore further the impact of Geneva Conventions as well.
I mean, so at the moment, the Geneva Conventions are in the background here because effectively all states are parties to that after World War II. And I think in order to understand kind of directly if the conventions have kind of constrained the effects of these conflicts, it would be ideal to take this research back into the 19th century. So I think this is something you can do. We have Civil War data, we have interstate war data, we even have infant mortality rate data that goes back to 1816. So this was something that I was part of when I was a PhD student, staying up far too late encoding this stuff. So there is I think, not unreasonable level of skepticism when you go back with this historical data. It tends to be a bit more unreliable. We have to be even more careful than we are, trying to understand the links between sort of conflict and these outcomes when you go back that far.
Okay, interesting. And you also had that expectation that the lingering effects of conflict would be worse than the immediate effects. What did you find on that?
So there's a good deal of evidence to support that. If we look at the sort of the core results, the core results kind of suggest if you have spent most of your time as a state involved in major interstate war, that this has the largest negative effect on infant mortality rates. So again, sort of going against what I expected of the interstate versus civil wars, but certainly in line with previous arguments that these sort of lingering effects tend to be the worst overall.
Mm. So what do we learn from this study about whether it's possible to do anything in order to mitigate the effects of war? I guess through these patterns you can start to see what factors seem to be having a bigger effect, what factors may be having a lesser effect. So you can begin to get a sense of where we should be focusing attention and trying to mitigate those effects.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think some of the robustness tests, flagged up some potential avenues that I think we need to better understand that may sort of mitigate the effects of conflict. So, there's a number of NGOs have written about kind of the usefulness of kind of humanitarian interventions on trying to mitigate the health effects of these conflicts. But so far, I haven't seen any kind of systematic work on that. And I think in many ways that would be sort of the next stage to understand, do these interventions have a kind of a sizable impact or not? I think that's one route. And then I think the other one is actually, and it's a really interesting topic because, so for example, in 2022, the US Department of Defense has now launched a review into what it calls Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan. The Secretary of Defense has tasked the armed services to precisely think about how they can limit the effects of these conflicts on civilians. So it's clearly of importance to the US Department of Defense at the moment. As a comparison, there was no sort of similar review taking place in the UK Ministry of Defence. There was a kind of a group of civil society organisations that have been pushing them to open up a review. So I think that's the other route is to actually have the kind of the interested parties whose obligations are actually to meet these sort of the Geneva Conventions. Is for them to actually start to understand, well, what are the actual effects of what we're doing, right? And can we change that? So I guess this type of research says, okay, the effects of what you're doing, seem to be bad. Here is some actual evidence that maybe you can think about. All right, so what did we do in these conflicts? What kinds of things happened, and what kinds of things should we be sort of changing?
Mm. So where do you plan to go next in this research? What you've mentioned some of the questions that a broader review should be taking on, but what are your own research plans in this area?
So I think it would be kind of really interesting to go back as far as we possibly can with this data, and then that will allow us to ask sort of the big question about what's the role of the Geneva Conventions here. So again, there's a lot of qualitative work on this. Public health specialists who so for example, there's the violations data center that has been capturing how civilians died in Syria in a sort of an amazing level of detail. But the question they can't answer is, would this be any different if the Geneva Conventions were not in place? And I think, if you like, that's for me is one of the key questions that I still think we don't know very much about. And then asking these questions about, do humanitarian interventions matter, right? Do they sort of mitigate the consequences of these conflicts? So I think those would be the two sort of biggest avenues for future research that I would be thinking about. And then probably sending various emails to various government departments, seeing if they would be interested in what I've been up to, and if they think it's of kind of any value in terms of how they go about, making policy in the future.
Well, let us hope so, because this is clearly incredibly important stuff. Thank you so much, Rod. It's been really very interesting to discuss this with you on as I say, such a very important topic as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me on today. It was a lot of fun.
And the study that we've been discussing is called War and Infant Mortality Rates by Rod Abuharb. It's available for online early view free of charge in the Journal of Human Rights, and we'll put the full details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be looking at a new proposal for how we should think about the role of the state in our society. It's called The Precautionary State, and it's going to make for a fascinating discussion. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of your time to rate or review us. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Connor Kelly and Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.